Jake had never been afraid of basements. In fact, he enjoyed the cool, dark spaces beneath houses, often using his own as a quiet refuge. But after moving into Harper's Hollow, a centuries-old house he had inherited from his great-uncle, the basement became the source of his nightmares. The house was old, full of charm, and slightly deteriorated, but it carried with it a dark history that Jake had not been fully aware of. The first night in the house, as he lay in bed, he heard strange noises coming from the basement below. Soft whispers, like the murmur of voices far away, seemed to crawl up the stairs. They were followed by the unmistakable sound of something being dragged across the floor. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Initially, Jake dismissed it as the creaking of an old house, the result of settling beams and loose pipes. But when the whispering turned into a low, guttural voice calling his name, Jake, he knew something was terribly wrong. The basement was always cold, unnervingly so, even during the height of summer. It was a sprawling labyrinth of stone walls, wooden beams, and forgotten rooms that extended farther than Jake had expected. He often felt uneasy when he descended into the basement, but there was one door, in particular, that filled him with dread. It was an old iron-bound door at the far end of the cellar, far older than the rest of the house, with rusted hinges and a lock that had long seized shut. Every time he approached it, an icy chill ran down his spine, and his skin prickled with the sense of being watched. For weeks, Jake tried to ignore the door, telling himself it was just his imagination. But the whispers grew louder each night, and the dragging sound became more insistent. Something was trying to get out, or perhaps something wanted him to open that door. One night, curiosity and fear got the better of him. Armed with a crowbar and a flashlight, he descended into the basement, determined to pry the door open and put his mind at ease. As he worked the crowbar into the gap between the door and the frame, a deep chill spread through the air. The temperature dropped so suddenly that Jake could see his breath fogging in front of him, swirling in the dim light of his flashlight. The metal groaned as he applied pressure, and with a loud, echoing creak, the door gave way. Beyond it lay a dark chamber, the smell of mold and rot thick in the air. The stench hit him first, an overpowering odor of rot and decay. It was as if the very air had been trapped for centuries, stagnant and foul. Inside the room, Jake's flashlight illuminated a grotesque scene. Old, rusted tools hanging from the walls, thick iron chains coiled in the corner. And something that made Jake's stomach churn, a row of coffins, each covered in thick layers of dust. Some of the coffins were still sealed, but others were cracked open, the wood splintered and decayed. Before he could investigate further, the door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging the room into complete darkness. Jake fumbled with his flashlight, his hands shaking as he tried to keep the beam steady. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing from every corner of the chamber. They were no longer distant. They were all around him, circling, closing in. His heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him. The voices weren't in his head. They were real. Something was moving in the dark, just out of sight, shuffling closer with each passing second. Jake felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as the sound of chains rattling filled the room. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, shuffled toward him from the shadows. Desperately, Jake slammed his fists against the door, but it wouldn't budge. His flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls, and in the brief moments of light, he saw them. Figures, pale and gaunt, their hollow eyes staring at him from the darkness. They were the dead, long forgotten and buried in this cursed chamber. Their chains rattled as they moved, dragging their skeletal forms toward him. A cold hand rested on Jake's shoulder. He screamed, spinning around, but there was no one there. The touch remained, icy fingers digging into his skin, pulling him down deeper into the basement. His screams echoed off the stone walls, but no one above could hear him. The basement had claimed another victim, just as it had for centuries. Later, when the house was sold again, no one ever found Jake. His disappearance became just another story whispered in the town, another chapter in the dark history of Harper's Hollow. The basement, however, remained locked, the iron-bound door sealed once more, waiting for the next curious soul to awaken the restless dead. For years, the old house at the edge of town had been abandoned. The Everett family had mysteriously disappeared nearly a century ago, leaving behind a crumbling mansion that loomed over the neighborhood like a dark secret. Its windows were boarded up, its once beautiful facade now covered in ivy and rot, and its doors had been chained shut to keep trespassers away. But that didn't stop the local kids from daring each other to explore the place, especially the dark, damp cellar below. The stories were always the same, people who went in never came out the same. Sarah wasn't one to believe in local legends, nor did she care about ghost stories. So when her friends dared her to spend the night in the cellar of the Everett house, she accepted without hesitation. After all, it was just an old house. What could be so terrifying about it? Armed with a flashlight, a blanket, and her phone, Sarah made her way to the house just after midnight, the time when, according to the stories, the spirits were most active. The old wooden door to the cellar was easy to pry open, its chains rusted and brittle from years of neglect. She descended the creaky stairs into the darkness below, her flashlight barely cutting through the thick, oppressive air. The cellar smelled of mildew and decay, the damp walls dripping with moisture. The air was so still that it felt as though the cellar hadn't been disturbed in decades. It was vast, much larger than Sarah had imagined, with stone pillars supporting the decaying structure above. Setting up her sleeping bag in the center of the cellar, Sarah shined her flashlight around the room, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. There was nothing inherently frightening about the space. It was just old and dusty. But as she settled in for the night, a feeling of unease began to creep in. It wasn't long before she found the first strange thing: scratch marks on the stone floor, leading toward the far wall where a pile of debris had been shoved aside. Intrigued, Sarah approached and discovered a small trapdoor hidden beneath the rubble. The trapdoor was ancient, its hinges rusted and swollen with age, but the fresh scratches on the floor suggested that it had been opened recently. Against her better judgment, Sarah cleared away the debris and, with some effort, pried the trapdoor open. A ladder descended into a narrow tunnel that seemed to go even deeper underground. The air that wafted up from the tunnel was colder, mustier, and carried with it a faint metallic scent. Blood, perhaps, or something worse. Her curiosity piqued. Sarah climbed down the ladder, her heart racing. The walls of the tunnel were damp, slick with moisture, and claustrophobic. She felt as though they were closing in on her with each step she took. The tunnel was long and twisted, the light from her flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. Finally, after what felt like hours, she reached the end, a small, circular room. The walls were rough, carved from the stone itself, and at the far end, something glinted in the faint light. It was a mirror, ancient and cracked, its surface covered in grime. The sight of it sent a shiver down Sarah's spine, though she couldn't explain why. She slowly approached, her flashlight beam unsteady as it flickered in the cold, damp air. But what chilled her to the bone wasn't the mirror itself. It was the absence of her reflection. The beam of light hit the mirror directly, but her face was nowhere to be seen. Instead, she saw the reflection of a man standing behind her. His face was distorted, twisted by the cracks in the glass, but he was undeniably there. His eyes were black voids, empty and hollow, his mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She spun around, the flashlight whipping through the air, but there was no one behind her, just the empty tunnel. Her pulse quickened, and panic began to rise in her chest. As she backed away from the mirror, the trapdoor above slammed shut with a loud, echoing bang. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat. She scrambled back to the ladder, her hands shaking as she tried to climb. She banged on the trapdoor, screaming for help, but it wouldn't budge. Her phone had no signal, and the battery was draining rapidly. She was trapped. The cold air pressed in around her, the silence becoming deafening. And then the whispers started, faint at first, like the wind moving through the cracks in the stone, but soon they grew louder, more distinct. They were calling her name. Sarah, Sarah. It was the man from the mirror. She was sure of it. His voice echoed through the tunnel, bouncing off the walls, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Her flashlight flickered again and then died, plunging her into total darkness. She fumbled in the blackness, her breathing ragged, her heart pounding in her ears. The cold seeped into her bones, freezing her in place. And then she felt it, a presence, standing just inches away from her, watching. She could feel the man's eyes on her, hear his faint, ragged breathing. Sarah's body went rigid with fear as she realized she wasn't alone in the tunnel. A hand touched her shoulder, cold, clammy, and impossibly strong. She screamed, but no one outside could hear her. The cellar had claimed another lost soul, just as it had so many before her. Michael had always been fascinated by the history of the Red House, a grand mansion perched at the edge of town, shrouded in mystery and tragedy. For years, it stood as a silent monument to the macabre, a place where unspeakable horrors were said to have unfolded. The house had been the site of countless tragedies, mysterious deaths, disappearances, and a fire that had claimed the lives of its last known occupants. But of all the stories that surrounded the Red House, none intrigued Michael more than the rumors of the basement, an area that, according to local legend, held a dark and terrible secret. Determined to uncover the truth, Michael managed to secure permission to explore the Red House. He arrived late one evening, just as the sun began to sink below the horizon, casting long shadows over the decaying structure. The house was eerily quiet, its once grand hallways now filled with dust and decay, the walls cracked and crumbling from years of neglect. The air inside was thick and musty, carrying the faint smell of smoke, as if the fire that had ravaged the house decades earlier still lingered in the atmosphere. The basement door was hidden behind a heavy, dusty bookshelf in the study, just as the rumors had said. It was old and heavy, its wooden surface worn and splintered, and the brass handle was tarnished with age. Michael hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the handle, but curiosity drove him forward. With a sharp tug, he pried the door open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the darkness below. The air grew colder as he made his way down the creaking steps, each footfall echoing ominously in the confined space. The basement was far larger than he had expected, a sprawling underground chamber, dimly lit by the pale glow of his flashlight. The walls were lined with old, rusted pipes, some of them leaking a slow, steady trickle of water onto the floor, which was slick and uneven, covered in a thin layer of stagnant moisture. It wasn't the size of the basement that unsettled him, though. It was the markings on the walls. Strange symbols, etched deep into the stone, covered every surface. Some were faded and barely visible, while others were fresh, as if someone had recently added to them. They looked like ancient runes, unfamiliar and ominous, and Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they were meant to keep something in or out. As Michael raised his camera to document the eerie scene, the lens flickered and glitched, struggling to capture the room. The battery, which had been fully charged, suddenly dropped to 20%. Annoyed, he switched to his audio recorder, but the static that filled his headphones made it difficult to pick up any clear sounds. Something was interfering with his equipment. It was as if the basement itself didn't want him there. A low, Rhythmic thudding sound came from deeper within the chamber. Michael froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The noise echoed off the stone walls, growing louder with each passing second. He swung his flashlight toward the source of the sound, but the beam only revealed more empty space, the shadows shifting as if they were alive. The thudding stopped, replaced by the sound of chains rattling in the far corner of the room. Michael moved cautiously toward the noise, his breath shallow. The rattling grew louder, more erratic, as if whatever was causing it was struggling against some invisible force. His flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering before cutting out completely. Panic surged through him as he fumbled with the light, but it wouldn't turn back on. The basement plunged into pitch blackness. For a moment, the only sound was the rapid thudding of his own heartbeat. Then, slowly, the chains began to rattle again, closer this time. Michael reached out blindly, trying to find his way back to the stairs, but the darkness was suffocating, disorienting. The sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, came from behind him, sending a cold wave of terror through his body. He spun around, but in the blackness, he could see nothing. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, a voice, low and guttural, whispered his name. Michael. It was barely audible, more of a rasp than a voice, but it was unmistakable. He wasn't alone in the basement. Fear gripped him as he backed away, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The voice whispered again, this time closer, and Michael felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. He whipped around, his heart racing, but the darkness pressed in on all sides. The basement walls seemed to close in around him, the air growing colder, heavier, as if the very room was alive, breathing in tandem with his own labored breaths. Suddenly, the sound of chains rattling filled the room again, louder this time, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of something dragging along the floor. Michael's body went rigid as he saw them. Dim, ghostly shapes emerging from the shadows, their eyes hollow, their bodies draped in heavy, rusted chains. They moved slowly, methodically, their chains scraping the stone floor as they inched closer. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on something, and he fell hard onto the damp floor. Pain shot up his spine, but before he could recover, one of the figures lunged toward him. Cold, bony hands wrapped around his wrists, the chains tightening as they dragged him deeper into the darkness. Michael struggled, kicking and thrashing, but the grip was impossibly strong. As he was pulled further into the basement, his screams were swallowed by the oppressive blackness. His camera, now forgotten, lay discarded on the floor, the lens cracked. The basement beneath the red house had claimed another victim, just as it had for generations before. The town would speak of his disappearance in hushed tones, adding his name to the long list of those who had vanished within the cursed walls of the red house. But no one would ever know the truth. No one would ever find him. Like so many before, Michael became another lost soul, trapped in the darkness, forever bound by the chains of the red house basement.